There's a moment that happens in the first half of Season 2 of Avatar The Last Airbender during an episode that's called Bitter Work. Uncle Iroh and Prince Zuko they have a conversation about the very nature of the cultures that inhabit the world of Avatar. This conversation serves two distinct purposes. First, in-universe, it's a way for Iroh to try and give his shithead nephew a bit of perspective on the world around him. His life has always been so Fire Nation-centric up to this point that he refuses to see what he can learn from the other nations around him. But in a meta sense, this conversation is Uncle Iroh's and the show's writers' way to tell the audience the nature of the various nations that inhabit the world of Avatar. But here's the thing, chances are that we as the audience have already inferred a lot of this through our time watching people bend. The Last Airbender is a masterclass in building a believable world and filling it with living cultures and the people who make up those cultures. However, I think that the most subtle and effective form of world building comes through the pure motion of bending itself and the utility that each provides. During my first time rewatching the show since I was like 16, this blew me away, and I just need to gush about it for a bit. So, if you'll indulge me, I'd like you to sit back, get bent, and let me tell you all about Avatar The Last Airbender and the physicality of world building. Airbending. Uncle Iroh describes the air nomads by saying, they detached themselves from worldly concerns and found peace and freedom. We see very little of actual air nomad culture, aside from Aang, flashbacks to Aang's childhood, and the architectures of their temples. And at the time that The Last Airbender starts, the genocide of the air nomads was committed 100 years prior, so their culture hasn't really been seen in the world in quite a few generations. All of that's to say that the show has to do most of its culture building through Aang. And even though the air nomads don't get a lot of screen time, I'd say Aang handles this pretty well. Based off the Chinese martial art of Ba Gua Zhang, airbending was one of two internal bending styles that is practiced in the world of Avatar. Internal martial arts, as opposed to its external cousins, are forms of martial arts that rely on relaxed, free-flowing movements and emotional tranquility. And Aang embodies all of these principles through his airbending style. Often, Aang can be seen utilizing his airbending to dodge attacks, and very rarely actually committing any offensive strikes unless it's in defense of himself or those around him. The flowing nature of Ba Gua Zhang and his prioritization on countering and fighting at a disadvantage lends itself perfectly to the airbender culture. While I could put on my tinfoil hat and say that I think there's much that can be inferred about the air nomad culture from the motions of their bending, such as the way that Aang uses wide, sweeping arm movements in order to gather up as much air as possible, hinting at a cultural bias towards being accepting of all people, i.e. welcoming them with open arms. I think the way that Aang uses his bending is the most emblematic of what Iroh tells us about the air nomad culture. Out of all the benders that we see during the show, Aang by far seems to have the most fun performing his bending. Whether it be riding around on his air scooter or flying in his glider, Aang generally has a smile on his face as he pursues the freedom granted by mastery over air. And commonly, he approaches any situation with a sense of childlike glee with his ability to defy gravity. Now, one might argue that this stems from the fact that he is indeed a child. But I'd argue that even a good portion of the airbenders that we see in Aang's flashbacks approach life with a similar, if not slightly, more mature disposition. The sense of detachment from the world, the readiness to leave it behind, and the moments of peace that are seen when Aang is airbending are all exemplary of the worldview that Iroh presents us. And there's one more thing I wanted to mention before I move on. I said before that Ba Gua Zhang was designed with fighting at a disadvantage in mind. Never being the one to start a fight, and only really fighting when necessary to protect oneself or one's loved ones. And constantly, throughout the series, we see Aang embodying this ideal. During any confrontation, he tries his hardest to push for a peaceful resolution to the conflict, going so far as to let himself get captured numerous times in order to maintain peace. His various battles with Prince Zuko during the earlier episodes are the most emblematic of this ideal. Almost every fight between the two, Aang is at a severe disadvantage, usually tied up, and generally doesn't land any offensive blows against Zuko. He uses his airbending to block and evade the fire. This is the epitome of being pursuant to a peaceful resolution, the true airbender way that Aang embodies. Waterbending. Uncle Iroh says of the water tribe, water is the element of change. The people of the water tribe are capable of adapting to many things. Push and pull, yin and yang. Waterbending is a form of bending that's all about give and take. The overarching sentiment of adaptability runs through all the water tribe members that we meet. While in certain instances both Katara and Sokka can be incredibly hard-headed, they often will relent if they find out they're in the wrong in any situation. Waterbending is based off Tai Chi, the other internal martial art on display. It focuses on grace, elegance, and control. While not particularly specializing in offense or defense, waterbending focuses on switching gracefully between a striking offense and a stalwart defense as needed, and in doing so, becomes perfectly adaptable to any situation. And if you need any further evidence of this, all you need to do is watch the waterbending fight between Katara and her soon-to-be master Paku. The fight is a back-and-forth affair. Both combatants utilize their abilities to press any offensive advantage, and then turn their opponent's attacks back on them in kind. While it's a violent fight, there's a beautiful sort of grace in the encounter. Both foes constantly changing water into ice, then to snow, and then back into water in a matter of seconds, showing the elegance and above all adaptability of waterbending as a martial art. And it's the grace of the art form that really implants into the audience the idea that that's how these water tribesmen will live their lives. While the Southern Water Tribe is in disrepair due to the Fire Nation attack many years ago, it's clear to see that this is not how this tribe is used to living. However, at the end of Season 1, when Team Avatar finally makes it to the Northern Water Tribe, the viewers' inklings about the Water Tribe are confirmed. The Tribe of the North lives in a sprawling, opulent, delicately crafted metropolitan city. The architecture's intricate, large murals of the moon and the Water Tribe symbols can be seen adorning buildings, and there's a mass transit system handled by canoes and canals that glide silently across the water. Also, not to mention the use of all three forms of water available, ice, snow, and of course water, to structure their lives, and this all comes together to form an almost Rivendell-esque city that paints the picture of a group of individuals who pride themselves on their elegance. They are willing to adapt and use everything around them to survive and thrive in a harsh climate, just like their bending style has taught us. Also, just another side note that didn't quite fit in anywhere else, to once again talk about their adaptability, waterbending is the type of bending with the most inherent uses. Regular water bending, ice bending, snow bending, blood bending, actual white mage levels of healing, the ability to manipulate some plants because they're filled with water, freaking cloud bending, and I always just kind of thought that was interesting. Earth bending. We once again turn to our good friend and overall best person of the year every year, Uncle Iroh, to hear what he wants to tell us about Earthbenders and the Earth Kingdom. He says, Earth is the element of substance. The people of the Earth Kingdom are diverse and strong. They are persistent and enduring. The people of the Earth Kingdom are peace-loving, varied, and above all resilient. The Fire Nation struggles greatly to crush the spirit of the Earth Kingdom, often breaking themselves against the walls of Omashu and Ba Sing Se time after time. These people are steadfast, unyielding, and dependable. Earthbending is based off Chinese Hung Gar Kung Fu, our first external form of martial arts, characterized by a short, wide stance, sliding movements, and powerful strikes. Earthbending is the peak defensive style in the Avatar universe, utilizing a wide, low stance in order to keep oneself balanced and keep connected to the earth, which they rely on. And generally, they don't even lift up their feet to readjust unless they have to. They often just slide their feet into the different stances. Unless you're Toph and then you do like cool jump slams, shockwave things, and holy shit, how is this the coolest character in any show ever and she's a 12-year-old blind girl. This constant connection to the earth is truly the focal point of earthbending, and why Aang struggles with it so much. On the first day of training, Toph explains to Aang, the key to earthbending is your stance. You've got to be steady and strong. Rock is a stubborn element. If you're going to move it, you've got to be like a rock yourself. And we can see through Toph's demonstrations as an earthbender that you need to be sturdy to properly bend. Show resilience when the rock fights back and doesn't want to move, and you always have to be connected to the earth. Sturdiness, resilience, connection to the earth, and those around you. All traits that we can see that Aang lacks when he's trying to learn. His stance is narrow, he lacks the confidence needed to show the rock who's boss, and time again he's rebuffed. He is far from embodying the ideals of an earthbender. Only near the end of the episode, when he finally realizes that he has the confidence needed to face down a charging beast, we see his demeanor change. A look of determination affixed to his face, a wide stance and strong arm movements allow him to earthbend. I think that King Bumi is the pure embodiment of what earthbending should be. He's the epitome of being quote-unquote sturdy, being well over 100 years old and still seemingly as sprightly as ever. He practices the concept of Jing, specifically neutral Jing, which is the habit of doing nothing and seeing how any situation develops. Some may call this stubbornness. His absolute willingness to do nothing in any situation, even going so far as to do nothing when his whole city is being overthrown just because it's the neutral Jing thing to do. But I'd say he's merely being a personification of the earth, unmoving until is acted upon. It's a stubborn element. But the people of the Earth Kingdom have long suffered at the hands of the ever-oppressive Fire Nation, longer than, well, the Water Tribe, I suppose, because the Air Nomads didn't suffer long. But they never give in. We constantly see refugees during the series, and generally they're not outwardly distraught. They always seem to be moving forward, looking to set down roots somewhere else, get their feet on solid ground. Those refugees and the capital city of Ba Sing Se, which held even the Great Dragon of the West at bay for 600 days, are peak Earth Kingdom culture. They're a group of people and a city so down to earth that they force the earth to move around them. Firebending. One would think that a former Fire Nation general and the famed Dragon of the West would have some interesting insight into the culture of the Fire Nation, right? Well, he describes fire as the element of power. The people of the Fire Nation have desire and will, and the energy and drive to achieve what they want. I think this is the most obvious bit of culture that the show provides. These are the people who went to war purely because they saw an opportunity in Sozin's comment. A strong, fiery will, and a love of ceremony and circumstance, but a necessity for control to ensure that fire does not get out of hand. The people of the Fire Nation are so willful that they feel the need to extend their reach beyond what is theirs. This is clearly showed in their bending. The Fire Nation finds its roots in Northern Shaolin-style martial arts, the most purely external form of martial arts in the bending world. Firebending is characterized by highly extended limbs, long reach, style, and overall aggression in order to overwhelm one's opponents. The Fire Nation's concept of an honor duel, the so-called Agni Kai, is the prime example of the philosophy behind firebending. Generally, they'll start far away from one another, trading pot shots in order to wear their adversary down. And once they sense weakness, a flash of all-out aggression erupts forth, hopefully crushing their opponents. Some of the most dangerous situations that firebenders find themselves in is often when they've overreached themselves, which, pun intended, leads them to getting burnt. Reflect on this far-reaching, hyper-aggressive, opportunistic style of bending and compare it to the Fire Nation as we've seen it. We know that even though they're far smaller than the much larger Earth Kingdom, they decided to declare war on all three opposing nations at once, simply because they saw an opportunity to do so. And while this sounds like a horrible idea on paper, the Fire Nation makes it work. They're the main antagonistic force in the entire world for over 100 years, and even a combined effort between the two remaining nations is not really enough to stop them. I mean, yeah, the Water and Earth Kingdoms slow them down a bit, but the audience is never really given the impression that the Fire Nation's ever losing ground. That is, until they overextend their reach when they know that the Avatar is growing ever stronger. They continue their war plan and eventually lose due to their own hubris. There's a great necessity for control in order for one to not burn oneself with fire, but the Fire Nation displays a great lack of it during the endgame of the series. A focus on aggression, a necessity for discipline, and pursuing their desires at all cost. This is the Fire Nation that we're presented, and it's an exact reflection of the necessities of their bending style. So, where does this leave us? Western cartoons have almost always been afraid to keep a cohesive world and story during their lifespans. This makes The Last Airbender a bit of an oddity in the Western world. The world of Avatar is dense with peoples and cultures, and while I may have been painting with a bit of a broad brush here, I find that there are a few other things that many other shows out there could learn from The Last Airbender. The first is the fact that it's okay to have a long-running narrative. Your audience might actually enjoy it. Anime's been doing it since the 60s, and it seems to be doing them just fine, but that's a topic for another day. And the other is the fact that you don't have to shout your world building at your audience. You can be subtle about it. Something as minor as how low someone squats when they do their magic rock sliding, or the sense of glee that another person exhibits while flying through the air are enough. Eagle-eyed viewers will catch these things. They'll think on them and then extrapolate them into what that means for the world at large. And even if a portion of your audience doesn't notice these things, since you made them so subtle, when you finally do build the world a bit more directly, they will already have been prepped for it subconsciously. Don't be afraid to build your world. As long as your characters are having fun in it, the audience will enjoy spending time in it as well. And I think this is where The Last Airbender really shines. It takes all of these steps to build a cohesive world, but the show never drags itself away from the characters of the narrative to do so. A natural, free-flowing lore. The physicality of world building.